the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. Stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal that caught and reflected the light from 1,000 worlds. And today it held representatives from 473 species, who had gathered to witness what the council called Justice Marcus. Chen stood in the center of the chamber wearing the simple blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, and his hands were bound with energy shackles that hummed softly. In the vast silence that had fallen over the assembled delegates, the charges against him were severe, and the evidence presented by the council prosecutors seemed overwhelming. Or at least that was what the council wanted everyone to believe when they displayed holographic projections of data transfers and communication logs that allegedly proved Chen had shared classified weapons technology with the Vilar colony. Rebellion Ambassador Sarah Rodriguez sat in Earth's delegation box with her fingers gripped so tightly around the armrest that her knuckles had gone white, and she had spent the last 3 days presenting evidence of Chen's innocence, while the council judges sat with expressions that ranged from boredom to barely concealed hostility. The defense had been simple and clear because Marcus Chen had never been to the Vialora system, and the timestamps on the alleged communications showed transmissions sent while Chen was verifiably attending a cultural exchange on Proxima Station with 200 witnesses, yet every piece of exculpatory evidence was dismissed on technical grounds that seemed to shift with each presentation. High Arbiter Zelkin rose from his seat at the center of the judicial panel, and his forearms spread wide in a gesture that commanded absolute attention from every being in the chamber, while his translator converted his clicking speech into words that echoed through the hall. The council has deliberated and finds the human Marcus Chen guilty of violating the sacred technology accords, Zelkin announced, and his voice carried no emotion as he continued. The penalty for this crime is death, and the sentence shall be carried out immediately. As a reminder to all species that council law supersedes individual protest, Sarah Rodriguez shot to her feet, and her voice rang out across the chamber with a desperation that made several nearby delegates flinch away from the raw emotion. "This is murder," she shouted. And protocol officers moved toward her position while she continued speaking rapidly. "You have ignored evidence and violated your own procedures, and if you do this, then Earth will comply with council authority," Zelkin interrupted, and his compound eyes fixed on Rodriguez with something that might have been pity or contempt. "Your species is young, and you must learn that individual lives matter less than galactic order." Marcus Chen had remained silent throughout the trial, but now he turned to face the section where Earth's delegation sat, and his expression, wise, was calm despite what was coming. "Tell them I was innocent," Chen said quietly. And though his voice was soft, the chamber's acoustics carried his words to every corner. "Tell them the truth. The execution device descended from the ceiling like a falling star, and it was a humane method by council standards because death would be instantaneous through the disruption of all neural activity, and the prisoner would feel nothing as their consciousness simply ceased to exist." Sarah Rodriguez was still shouting and struggling against the protocol officers, who were now physically restraining her, while other members of Earth's delegation sat in stunned silence. And some were recording everything on their personal devices, because even in this moment, they understood the importance of documentation. The device activated with a sound like distant thunder, and Marcus Chen's body collapsed to the crystal floor, while the energy shackles deactivated automatically. And the grand chamber fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah Rodriguez screaming in rage and grief. "High Arbiter." Zelkin made a gesture of finality with his upper right arm and turned away from the body as cleaning drones began their approach. "Let this serve as an example," he stated. "Council law is absolute." The broadcast of the execution was transmitted across the galaxy through the standard diplomatic channels, and on Earth, the feed appeared simultaneously on 14 billion personal devices and public screens as people stopped whatever they were doing to watch their representative. In Geneva, the emergency session of the United Earth government convened within minutes, and President Chen Li stood before the assembly with tears streaming down her face because Marcus had been her cousin and she had recommended him for the diplomatic position. "They murdered him," she said. and her voice was flat and cold in a way that made the assembled representatives lean forward in their seats. They ignored evidence and violated their own laws, and they murdered a human being. The vote was unanimous, and the resolution was brief because sometimes the most important decisions required the fewest words. And the text simply read, "Earth hereby withdraws all diplomatic recognition of the Galactic Council and recalls all human personnel from Council space effective immediately." Secretary General Williams stood and added a motion that passed with equal unanimity. And this one authorized the activation of defense protocols that had been theoretical exercises just hours before across human space. The response was immediate and synchronized in a way that surprised even Earth's own military planners. And civilian ships began returning to Sol System while military vessels moved to defensive positions around every human colony and outpost. The Council expected protests and angry messages, and perhaps some ineffectual posturing from this young species that had joined galactic civilization barely 60 years ago. But instead, they received only silence as Earth's communication channels when Dark Ambassador Rodriguez and the entire Earth delegation departed Council Central Station without fanfare or official farewell. And they carried with them complete recordings of the trial, including footage from 17 different angles that showed every procedural violation and every ignored piece of evidence. Journey back to Earth took 4 weeks through standard jump routes, and Rodriguez spent that time editing together a documentary that she titled The Trial of Marcus Chen, a complete record, and she ensured that every frame showed the truth of what had happened. The delegation's ship entered orbit around Earth. They found a planet transformed, because the casual observer would see little difference, but those who understood military logistics could recognize the signs of mobilization shipyards that had built colony. Vessels and cargo haulers were now producing craft with reinforced hulls and weapon mounts. And research stations had shifted their focus from terraforming and medicine to fields that the Council had specifically prohibited on the lunar surface. New construction created structures whose purpose was unclear, but whose scale suggested something significant. And power generation across the solar system had increased by 40% in just 1 month, President Chen Li addressed the planet in a broadcast that was simultaneously translated into 234 languages. And she stood before a simple backdrop that showed an image of Marcus Chen smiling at some diplomatic function. They killed him because they could. They killed him because they believed we would accept it, and they believed we were too weak or too afraid to respond. She paused and let the silence stretch for several seconds, while 14 billion people watched and waited. They were wrong. She continued, "We will not be returning to Council space. We will not be seeking their approval or recognition, and we will not be following their laws." The broadcast ended, and Earth's silence continued, while across human space every person understood that something fundamental had changed, and the age of humanity seeking acceptance from the galactic community had ended. The Council waited for Earth to calm down and return to negotiations, because that was what species did after making their protest. But the humans did not return, and the silence stretched from weeks to months. Intelligence reports began filtering back to Council Central with concerning details about human activity. And these reports spoke of weapon development and fleet expansion, and worst of all, a systematic study of Council military doctrine and tactics. High Arbiter Zelkin reviewed these reports with growing unease, and he called a special session to address what he termed the human situation, because even he was beginning to suspect that perhaps his people had miscalculated. They are a young species, experiencing growing pains, insisted Council Admiral Tresh, and his translator made his whistling speech sound confident. One show of force, and they will comply. The decision was made to send a fleet to Earth's nearest colony at Tau Ceti, and the Council was certain this would end the standoff and restore proper order. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The Council Chamber Security Committee met in closed session 3 months after Marcus Chen's execution, and the mood in the room was less confident than it had been. When they had authorized the sentence, Intelligence Director Krathik spread his sensory tendrils across the data displays that floated. In the center of the table, and the information they showed contradicted everything the council thought they knew about human capabilities. The shipyard activity is concerning, Krathik began, and his translated voice carried undertones that his species used to indicate deep worry. They have converted 73% of civilian construction facilities to military production. Admiral Tresh made a dismissive gesture with his primary manipulator, and his expression showed the confidence of someone who had fought and won 100. Campaigns' numbers without quality mean nothing, he argued. Human technology is at best adequate, and their military experience is limited to minor conflicts with pirates and internal peacekeeping. Krathik's tendrils twitched in a way that indicated disagreement, and he pulled up a new data stream that showed cultural analysis reports compiled by council anthropologists. I recommend the committee review these assessments of human entertainment media, he suggested. And several committee members made sounds of confusion. Because what did entertainment have to do with military capability? The display showed statistics that seemed absurd in their scope because humans produced approximately 4 million hours of warfare-related content annually across all their various media formats, and this had been consistent for the past 200 years of their recorded history. Admiral Tresh examined a randomly selected film titled The Battle of the Thermopylae that showed a small group of ancient human warriors fighting against overwhelming odds. And the tactical creativity on display made him pause despite himself. This is fiction, he said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Stories they tell themselves for amusement. Look at the volume, Krathik insisted. And he pulled up more data that showed humans consumed an average of 12 hours per week of content focused on warfare, strategy, and conflict. Every human has spent thousands of hours mentally rehearsing combat scenarios. Council psychologist Vanara had been silent until now, but she leaned forward, and her bioluminescent patches pulsed with agitation. We need to understand what this means from a psychological perspective, she said, and her voice was soft but urgent. Most species develop entertainment around cooperation and harmony and resource management because those are the skills that allowed them to achieve civilization. She paused and pulled up comparative data from a dozen other species before continuing. Humans are different because their evolutionary path involved constant intraspecies conflict. She explained, they fought themselves for thousands of years before achieving unity, and their entertainment reflects this. History. The committee watched footage from a human video game that simulated planetary invasion, and the level of tactical detail was extraordinary because players had to manage logistics and troop morale and combined arms coordination. This is a children's game, Vanara noted. Recommended for ages 12 and above. Admiral Tresh was beginning to look uncomfortable, and he shifted his position while reviewing reports from council observers who had been monitoring human space before the diplomatic withdrawal. What about their actual military forces? He asked, and his tone suggested he was looking for reassurance. Sethik pulled up the latest intelligence reports, and the news was not encouraging because human military activity had increased by a factor of 7 since Chen's execution, and recruitment centers were reporting overwhelming volunteer numbers. They have mobilized their reserve forces and implemented what they called general conscription across all colonies, Krathik reported. Every human between ages 18 and 45 is now receiving military training. The numbers were staggering because Earth and its colonies held a population of 14 billion. And if even a fraction of those became combat-ready soldiers, then the humans could field an army larger than the Council's entire standing military. Impossible, Tresh argued. The logistics alone would be overwhelming, and they cannot arm and equip such numbers. But the data showed that human manufacturing had shifted almost entirely to military production, and their 3D printing technology allowed for rapid production of equipment at scales that Council found difficult to comprehend. Vena brought up another concerning point that made several committee members shift. Uncomfortably, their social cohesion has increased dramatically, she noted, and psychological profiles showed a species unified by grief and anger. The execution has created what humans call a martyr, and this has eliminated most internal divisions. Political factions that had been arguing about resource allocation and colonial policy had set aside their differences, and the entire species seemed focused on a single goal, though the council was uncertain what that goal actually is. High Arbiter Zelkin entered the chamber without announcement, and his presence made everyone immediately stand in respect for his authority. Report, he commanded. And Krathik summarized the intelligence findings, while Zelkin listened with an expression that was difficult to read when. The report concluded. Zelkin was silent for nearly a minute, and his forearms were crossed in a posture that indicated deep contemplation. What are our xenopsychologists saying about human intentions? He finally asked. Venora accessed her files and pulled up the consensus report from the Council's team of human specialists, and her bioluminescent patches dimmed as she read the conclusions. They believe the humans are preparing for war, she said quietly. Total war. Admiral Tresh made a sound of derision. But Venara continued speaking, and her voice gained strength. The term total war has specific meaning in human history, she explained, and she displayed definitions and historical examples. It means the complete subordination of society to military objectives and the elimination of distinction between civilian and military resources. The committee watched historical footage from Earth's 20th century world wars, and the scale of mobilization was terrifying, because entire planetary economies had been converted to weapon production, while populations endured hardship that most council species would consider unacceptable. They did this to themselves, Venara emphasized. They fought with such intensity that they developed weapons capable of destroying their own planet, and they nearly used them. Zelkin watched the footage of atomic weapons detonating over human cities, and his expression shifted from dismissive to concerned. Surely they have evolved beyond such barbarism, he suggested. But his voice lacked conviction. Have they? Venara questioned, and she pulled up recent human military doctrine papers that had been intercepted. Their strategic planning still includes scenarios for mutual destruction and acceptable casualties measured in billions. The committee sat in uncomfortable silence while they contemplated what it meant to face a species that thought in such terms. Krathik brought up the final piece of intelligence that had prompted this emergency session, and it was a message that had been intercepted from Earth's military command to all human colonies. The message was simple and consisted of only 3 words that, when translated, read, "Remember Marcus Chen." "They are not going to negotiate," Krathik said, and his tendrils curled protectively around his body. "They are not posturing for advantage, and they are not seeking concessions. Then what do they want?" Admiral Tresh demanded. Venna answered with certainty that came from months of studying human psychology and culture and history. "Justice," she said, and the word hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom. "They want what they believe Marcus Chen was denied." Zelkin made a decision that he hoped would resolve the situation before it escalated beyond control. "We will send a fleet to demonstrate council authority," he announced. A show of force to remind the humans of their place in the galactic order. Krathik and Venara both started to protest. But Zelkin raised a hand for silence. "The council has spoken," he stated. "Prepare the fleet for deployment to Tau Ceti." Admiral Tresh smiled with satisfaction because this was familiar territory, and he understood force, projection, and military intimidation. And he was certain the humans would back down when faced with superior firepower. The committee adjourned and began making preparations. And none of them noticed Venara's bioluminescent patches flashing in the pattern her species used to signal impending disaster across human space. The preparations continued with mechanical efficiency, and ship after ship emerged from construction facilities with hulls that gleamed under the light of different suns in underground facilities on Mars and Europa and a dozen other locations. Scientists worked on projects that would have violated every Council technology accord if those agreements still held any meaning to Eartha. Humans did not broadcast their intentions or make threats because they were too busy working, and every person understood their role in what was coming. Earth, a mother named Rebecca Chen, visited her son's grave in the diplomatic memorial garden, and she placed flowers, while 14 billion other humans went about their tasks. They were ready. And soon the Council would understand what it meant to awaken a species that had spent its entire existence preparing for war. The Council fleet emerged from jump space at the edge of the Tau Ceti system with the kind of overwhelming force that had pacified rebellious colonies 100 times before. And Admiral Tresh surveyed his command with satisfaction from the bridge of the massive dreadnought. Celestial Authority 300 warships spread across local space in a formation designed to inspire awe and terror. And their combined firepower could reduce a planet to radioactive dust within hours, broadcast the standard compliance message. And his communications officer initiated the transmission. That demanded immediate surrender and the resumption of Council authority. The response from Tau Ceti colony came within minutes. And the human voice was calm and almost pleasant in tone, despite the fleet position to destroy everything they had built. This is Colonial Administrator Williams. The transmission began. We acknowledge your presence and request you withdraw immediately or face defensive action. Admiral Tresh made a sound that his translator rendered as contemptuous laughter because the colony had perhaps a dozen patrol craft and minimal orbital defenses defensive action. He repeated mockingly. And he ordered his fleet to advance toward the inhabited worlds. Prepared to demonstrate what happens to species that defy Council authority, the fleet moved forward in perfect formation, and their shields were active while targeting systems. Locked onto the obvious military installations around Tau Ceti's primary colony world then. The first mine detonated against the port flank of the formation. And the explosion was massive enough to destroy 3 cruisers instantly, while damaging a dozen more evasive maneuvers. Tresh shouted. But the minefield was dense and well camouflaged, and ships began triggering additional explosions as they tried to scatter them. Humans had seeded the approach corridor with thousands of mines that had been lying dormant and undetectable. And now they activated in sequence to create a gauntlet of destruction. Admiral Tresh's tactical display showed red indicators, spreading across his fleet like a plague. And he realized with growing horror that the humans had predicted his exact approach vector. How did they know? His tactical officer asked, and the answer was displayed on intercept analysis that showed the humans had studied every Council military operation for the past 50 years. They knew because humans had spent decades watching and learning and cataloging how Council forces operated, and they had identified patterns that Council admirals did not even realize they followed. The fleet pushed through the minefield with heavy losses, and Tresh regrouped his forces for an assault on the colonial defenses that should have been a simple operation. That was when the patrol craft appeared on sensors. And there were far more than intelligence had suggested, because 50 small ships accelerated toward the Council fleet with reckless speed. Destroy them, Tresh ordered. And his gunners opened fire with weapons that should have vaporized the attacking craft, but the human ships moved with impossible agility, and their pilots flew in patterns that seemed suicidal until Council ships began colliding with each other, trying to track their movements. Humans were using the Council fleet's own size against them, and they darted between larger ships, while firing missiles that targeted sensor arrays and communication nodes. Admiral Tresh watched in disbelief as his fleet's coordination began to deteriorate, because the humans were not trying to destroy his ships but to blind and deafen them. Then the colonial defense platforms revealed themselves, and they were not in the locations that orbital surveys had indicated, because the humans had shown the Council fake installations while hiding their real weapons. Railgun fire sleeted through space with kinetic energy that punched through shields the Council had thought were impenetrable, and the humans had somehow developed weapons that operated on principles Council scientists claimed were impossible. Return fire, Tresh commanded. But his ships were scattered and confused, and targeting solutions kept failing as human electronic warfare systems jammed and spoofed their sensors. A wing of human craft executed what appeared to be a retreat, and a Council squadron pursued them directly into an ambush where converted cargo haulers had been waiting with improvised but devastating weapons. The humans were fighting without honor or rules, and they used tactics that the Council considered unsporting, like false surrenders in civilian vessels that suddenly revealed hidden weapon systems. Admiral Tresh's flagship took a direct hit from a kinetic projectile moving at point-to-light speed, and the impact sheared off the port weapons array while venting atmosphere from 3 decks. Withdraw to defensive positions, he ordered through emergency channels, and his fleet pulled back to regroup while human Forces harassed their retreats. The Battle of Tau Ceti lasted 14 hours and ended with the Council fleet retreating to the edge of the system, having lost 67 ships and suffering damage to nearly all the survivors. Human losses were significantly lower because they had fought smart rather than honorably, and they had used every advantage that creativity and desperation could provide. Admiral Tresh sat in his damaged command chair while medical teams treated wounded crew members, and he struggled to comprehend how his overwhelming force had been defeated by what should have been an easy target. The transmission that arrived from Tau Ceti colony was not gloating or threatening, and Administrator Williams spoke with the same calm tone he had used before the battle. "We have taken 347 prisoners, including several of your officers," Williams stated. "They are being treated in accordance with basic sapient rights and will be returned when this conflict concludes." The transmission shifted to show Council prisoners in clean medical facilities receiving treatment for their injuries, and human doctors worked alongside captured Council medical staff to provide care. "We want you to watch something," Williams continued, and the feed changed to show footage from Marcus Chen's trial. Humans had edited together every procedural violation and every ignored piece of evidence, and they had overlaid analysis from legal experts across a dozen species. Recording showed High Arbiter Zelkin dismissing defense testimony without cause, and it showed the prosecution presenting evidence that had been digitally manipulated, and it showed a system of justice that had been corrupted by political convenience. "This is what you did," Williams said quietly. "This is the justice that your council claims to represent." The transmission was not just sent to Admiral Tresh, but was broadcast across the entire galaxy through channels the council did not control. And billions of beings watched the truth about Marcus Chen's execution in Council Central Station. Emergency sessions convened as member species demanded explanations, and some of the smaller delegations began questioning whether the Council's authority was as legitimate as they had always believed. High Arbiter Zelkin watched the human broadcast with growing fury, and he ordered a complete information blackout to prevent further distribution, but the humans had prepared for this, and their message was already spreading through networks that the Council could not shut down because humans had spent years quietly establishing their own communication infrastructure intelligence. Director Krathik reported something even more disturbing than the military defeat at Tau Ceti, and his tendrils trembled as he displayed evidence of human special forces operating deep within Council space. "They have teams on 15 different worlds," he reported. "They are extracting individuals who have been persecuted by Council authorities." The humans were not just fighting a military campaign, but were conducting a public relations offensive that undermined Council legitimacy. And they were making allies among species who had grievances against Council justice on the Vilar colony where the rebellion had supposedly occurred. Human agents made contact with the rebel leadership and provided them with evidence that the whole incident had been fabricated by Council intelligence. The technology transferred that Marcus Chen had been executed for had never happened, and the entire case had been manufactured to justify cracking down on the Velor independence movement. When this evidence was broadcast, the effect was explosive because species across the galaxy began questioning how many other Council actions had been based on lies. Admiral Tresh submitted his report on the Tau Ceti disaster, and he included tactical analysis that showed the humans had studied Council military doctrine with obsessive thoroughness. "They knew how we would approach and where we would position our forces," he wrote. "They knew what tactics we would use and what formations we preferred, and they exploited every predictable pattern." The report concluded with a recommendation that chilled the Council leadership, because Tresh suggested that continuing military operations against the humans would result in unacceptable casualties. Council chambers erupted in debate as some members called for immediate peace negotiations, while others demanded overwhelming retaliation, and the unity that had characterized Council decisions for centuries began to fracture. High Arbiter Zelkin called for order, and his forearms spread wide in a gesture of authority that seemed less effective than it had before. "We will not negotiate with terrorists," he declared. "We will not allow a single species to dictate terms to the entire galactic community." The formal declaration arrived 6 months after Marcus Chen's execution, and it was not a message but a coordinated military action that struck simultaneously at 17 council facilities across 8 sectors of Space High. Arbiter Zelkin watched the tactical displays with something approaching disbelief as red indicators bloomed across the map, showing attacks that should have been impossible to coordinate. How are they moving so fast? He demanded, and his military advisors had no answers. Because human ships were appearing in locations that required faster-than-light travel beyond anything the Council had developed intelligence. Director Krathic had been investigating this question for weeks, and he finally had an answer that explained the impossible. They had been experimenting with jump drive modifications that we explicitly prohibited, he reported, and his voice carried a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. They destabilize the quantum fields to achieve higher velocities at the cost of significant danger to the crew. Why would anyone accept such risk? Zelkin asked. Because they are willing to die to win, Krathic answered simply. And that reality was becoming increasingly clear as the conflict progressed. The human attack on Council Station 7 demonstrated capabilities that violated established physics as understood by galactic science, and their weapons bypassed shields that had protected Council installations for centuries immoral. Tresh reviewed the damage reports and noted that the humans had targeted communication nodes and logistics centers rather than population areas. And this pattern was consistent across all their operations. They are not trying to kill us, he observed. They are trying to cripple our ability to coordinate and respond. His tactical analysis was correct because the humans had studied enough military history to understand that destroying an enemy's capacity to make war was more effective than simple slaughter on Earth. The transformation of society continued with a totality that amazed even those who had studied human history. And every aspect of civilization had been reorganized around a single goal. Manufacturing facilities that once produced consumer goods now created components for warships and weapons. And the civilian population accepted rationing and hardship without significant protest. President Chenli walked through a converted automobile factory where workers assembled missile guidance systems with the same precision they had once used to build vehicles. And she stopped to speak with a young woman operating a fabrication machine. How are you managing? Chenli asked. The worker looked up, and her expression showed exhaustion mixed with determination that had become characteristic of the entire species. My brother was in the diplomatic corps, she answered. He worked with Marcus Chen, and he said Marcus was the best of them. She did not need to say more because that story was repeated across Earth with minor variations. And everyone knew someone who had known Marcus Chen or had been inspired by his work, though. Human military had grown to include 4 million active combat personnel and another 20 million in support roles. And this force was equipped with technology that improved. With each passing month, General Martinez reviewed the latest weapon systems. With a team of scientists who had abandoned pure research to focus on practical applications, the new kinetic accelerators are ready for field testing, reported Dr. Sarah Kim. And she pulled up specifications that showed weapons capable of firing projectiles at point for light speed. What about the shield disruption technology? Martinez asked. We have breakthrough, answered Dr. Chen Wang. And his excitement was visible despite his exhaustion. We can create localized quantum fluctuations that collapse Council shield harmonics. The technology was based on principles the Council had deemed impossible, and human scientists had achieved it by ignoring what they were told could not be done and simply experimenting until something worked. On Titan, the massive shipyards launched 3 new carriers that would serve as mobile bases for strike craft, and these vessels incorporated stealth technology adapted from surveillance satellites. The Council's attempt at a counteroffensive met with disaster at the Battle of Proxima, where human forces demonstrated tactical flexibility that seemed almost precognitive. Admiral Vishtar had planned a 3-pronged assault that should have overwhelmed the human defenders through sheer numbers. But his fleet ran into defenses that appeared to know exactly where each prong would strike. They have infiltrated our communications, Vishtar realized too late. and his secure channels were broadcasting every order directly to human intelligence. Human. Cyber warfare specialists had broken Council encryption months ago, and they listened to every Council transmission while feeding false information back through compromised networks. Battle turned into a rout as human forces counterattacked with precision that exploited every weakness in Council formations. And Vishtar barely escaped with a quarter of his original fleet in the Council chambers. The debate grew heated as member species began questioning the wisdom of continuing the conflict. And some of the smaller delegations had started secret communications with Earth High Arbiter Zelkin found his authority challenged for the first time in his long career. And the Velar delegation formally accused him of manufacturing the evidence that had led to Marcus Chen's execution. These are lies spread by human propaganda, Zelkin insisted. But the evidence was becoming overwhelming as more witnesses came forward. A Council intelligence officer named Krenix defected to the humans and brought with him complete files on the Chen operation. And his testimony confirmed what many had suspected: the whole case was fabricated on orders from Zelkin's office. Krennic stated in a broadcast that reached every corner of the galaxy, Marcus Chen was innocent, and we killed him to intimidate the humans into compliance. The revelation shattered what remained of Council unity, and 3 member species formally withdrew their delegations. While demanding reforms, and Earth researchers made another breakthrough that would change the nature of the conflict when they successfully tested what they called a quantum entanglement network that allowed instantaneous communication across any distance. This gives us a coordination advantage that the Council cannot match, explained Dr. Kim, and she demonstrated how human forces could now operate with perfect synchronization regardless of separation. General Martinez immediately grasped the strategic implications, because an army that could communicate instantly was an army that could respond to any threat with perfect timing. The human counteroffensive began 3 months after the initial declaration, and it demonstrated the full scope of what total war meant when waged by a species that had spent its entire history perfecting the art. Strike teams appeared on Council worlds to extract political prisoners who had been detained without trial, and these operations were broadcast live to show the galaxy that humans fought for justice rather than conquest. In the mining world of Trathker, human special forces freed 200 detainees who had been imprisoned for speaking against Council policies, and they did so without firing a shot through careful planning and precise execution. The rescued prisoners were taken to human facilities, where they received medical care and legal assistance. And many chose to remain with the humans rather than return to Council authority. Admiral Tresh met with High Arbiter Zelkin in a secure chamber, and the Admiral's expression showed a warrior who had finally accepted an uncomfortable truth. We cannot win this militarily, Tresh stated bluntly. The humans are not superior to us in any single category, but they are superior in adaptability and determination. He pulled up comparative analysis that showed human forces learning and evolving with each engagement. While Council tactics remain static, they treat war like a science. Tresh continued. They analyze every battle and incorporate lessons immediately, while we rely on doctrine that has not changed in centuries. Zelkin refused to accept this assessment because doing so would mean admitting that his decision to execute Marcus Chen had been catastrophically wrong. We will mobilize more forces, he insisted. We will demonstrate overwhelming power, but the votes were no longer there because Council members had seen the costs of escalation, and they had read the historical files that humans had made freely available. Those files told the story of human wars throughout their history, and they showed a species that would endure unimaginable suffering rather than surrender what they believed was right. The Council leadership spent a full day reviewing footage from Earth's 20th century conflicts, and they watched human cities reduced to rubble while the populations continued fighting. They saw images of total societal mobilization. Every resource was dedicated to victory regardless of cost. And they saw casualty figures that exceeded the entire population of some Council species. They did this to each other.
Psychologist Venara pointed out.
Imagine what they will do to us if we push them to that extreme. The council had to make a choice between continuing a war they could not win or accepting terms from a species they had. Thought beneath their notice high arbiter Zelkin sat alone in his chambers and reviewed the file on Marcus Chen. And he read about a diplomat who had dedicated his life to building bridges between species. The human had been innocent. And Zelkin had known this when he ordered the execution because the goal had been to send a message about council authority. The council chamber was filled to capacity 18 months after Marcus Chen's execution, and the atmosphere carried a weight that made even the most senior delegates speak in hushed tones. High Arbiter Zelkin stood at his traditional position, but his forearms hung loosely at his sides in a posture that his species used to indicate defeat or submission. The council has deliberated, he began, and his voice lacked the commanding certainty that had characterized his pronouncements for decades. We accept the terms proposed by Earth. The declaration sent ripples through the assembled delegates because this was the first time in recorded galactic history that the council had capitulated to demands from a single-member species. Ambassador Sarah Rodriguez sat in Earth's restored delegation box, and she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before the weight of what came next settled on her shoulders. Peace treaty was comprehensive and represented a fundamental restructuring of galactic governance that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Article 1 established the exoneration of Marcus Chen and declared his execution a crime against sapient rights, and his name would be entered into the galactic record as a symbol of judicial reform. Article 2 mandated the creation of an independent judicial review board with representatives from all member species, including humanity, and this board would have authority to investigate accusations of procedural violations. Article 3 implemented what humans called due process and required that all accused individuals receive fair trials with access to defense representation and the right to present exculpatory evidence. The remaining articles detailed mechanisms for enforcement and oversight, and they included provisions that gave Earth special status as a guarantor of these reforms. President Chenli addressed the council via holographic transmission, and behind her stood a memorial wall inscribed with the names of every human who had died in the conflict. Justice was not achieved through victory in battle, she stated clearly. Justice is achieved when systems change to prevent future injustices. Her words were translated into 400 languages and broadcast across the galaxy, and they resonated with billions of beings who had lived under council authority without questioning its legitimacy. Formal signing ceremony took place on neutral ground at a station constructed specifically for this purpose, and representatives from every species attended to witness the historic moment. High Arbiter Zelkin signed the treaty with visible reluctance, and when he passed the document to President Chen Li, their eyes met briefly. I believed I was protecting galactic order, Zelkin said quietly. You were protecting your power, Chen Li responded without anger. There is a difference. The treaty included provisions for the trial of those responsible for Marcus Chen's execution, and the proceedings would be conducted under the new judicial standards that Earth had insisted upon. Zelkan and 3 other council officials faced charges before an independent tribunal, and for the first time in galactic history, the accused were given full rights to mount a defense. Though trial lasted 6 weeks and was broadcast continuously, and legal scholars from across the galaxy watched as evidence was presented and challenged according to procedures that prioritized truth over convenience. In the end, Zelkin was found guilty of judicial misconduct and abuse of authority, and he was sentenced to removal from office and a period of supervised community service rather than execution. We will not become what we fought against, explained Chief Justice Martinez during the sentencing. Punishment should serve justice rather than vengeance. The galaxy watched this display of restraint, and many species began implementing similar reforms in their own legal systems because the humans had demonstrated that strength and mercy were not incompatible. Tresh submitted his resignation from military service, but President Chenli personally rejected it and instead offered him a position training. Human and council forces and joint operations, we need people who understand both sides, she explained when Tresh questioned the offer. We need to build something better than what existed before Tresh accepted because he recognized wisdom when he heard it. And he became one of the architects of a new galactic defense force that incorporated human tactical flexibility with council institutional knowledge. Economic impact of the war had been devastating for both sides, and reconstruction efforts became a joint venture that brought former enemies together in common purpose on Tau Ceti colony. Human engineers worked alongside council specialists to rebuild facilities damaged in the first battle, and the cooperation gradually eroded the suspicion that had characterized initial interactions. Intelligence Director Krathik found himself working with his human counterpart Sarah Kim to establish information-sharing protocols that would prevent the kind of intelligence manipulation that had led to Marcus Chen's execution. Your people are remarkably pragmatic, Krathik observed during one planning session. We have to be, Kim responded. We spent enough of our history killing each other that we learned the cost of holding grudges. The establishment of the Office of Sapient Rights became one of the most significant developments in galactic governance. And this institution had authority to investigate complaints from any being regardless of their species or status. First case brought before the office involved a labor dispute on a mining colony, and the resolution set precedents that would influence galactic law for generations. Earth's military did not demobilize after the peace treaty because President Chen Li understood that the reforms they had fought for would need protection. Instead, human forces became the enforcement arm of the new galactic order, and their fleets patrolled space lanes to ensure that council reforms were implemented. Honestly, some species resented this human authority, but they could not deny that the galaxy had become more just under the new system. Admiral Rodriguez, who had been promoted after her role in exposing Chen's innocence, commanded the new Guardian fleet that stood ready to intervene if any species attempted to return to the old ways. We are not here to rule, she explained during her first address to the fleet. We are here to protect the principles that Marcus Chen died for. On Earth, a memorial was constructed in Geneva that bore the names of everyone who had died in the conflict. And at the center stood a statue of Marcus Chen with an inscription that read, "Justice delayed is justice denied, President Chen." Li visited the memorial on the anniversary of Marcus's execution, and she found herself approached by a young woman who wore the uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps. I am heading to my first posting tomorrow, the young diplomat said. I wanted to see this before I left. Where are they sending you? Chenli asked. Council Central Station, came the reply. I will be working with the Judicial Review Board. Chenli smiled because this was exactly the kind of work that Marcus would have wanted to do. And his legacy was being carried forward by those who understood the importance of the fight. Galaxy had changed in fundamental ways during the 18 months of conflict, and species that had accepted council authority without question now demanded transparency and accountability. The Viller colony received formal independence after a referendum supervised by neutral observers, and their first act as a sovereign nation was to establish diplomatic relations with Earth. Former rebels became government officials, and they implemented a constitution based partly on human principles of individual rights and limited government power. Other colonies began similar independence movements, and the council was forced to accept that the era of unquestioned central authority had ended. The humans had not set out to dismantle the galactic order, but their insistence on justice had revealed the fragility of systems. It's built on assumption rather than consent. 5 years after the peace treaty, representatives from all galactic species gathered for a constitutional convention that would formally restructure interstellar governance. The resulting document drew heavily from human political philosophy, but incorporated elements from dozens of species. And it created a federal system that balanced local autonomy with collective security. Earth declined a permanent seat on the new Council of Species, preferring instead to maintain its role as an independent guarantor of rights. We do not want to rule, President Chen Li explained during the convention. We want to ensure that what happened to Marcus Chen cannot happen to anyone. The new constitution included a Bill of Sapient Rights that guaranteed protections that would have seemed radical just a few years earlier, and every species ratified the document within a standard year. Admiral Tresh retired after helping establish the joint training programs that brought council and human military doctrine together. And he wrote a memoir that became required reading at military academies across the galaxy. The humans taught us that adaptability matters more than tradition, he wrote. And they taught us that justice should be more than a word used to justify authority on Earth. The schools began teaching galactic history, with emphasis on the reforms that followed the conflict. And students learned about Marcus Chen as the man whose death changed civilization Dr. Sarah Kim continued her work on advanced propulsion systems, but now she shared her research openly with council scientists, and the collaborative effort led